This video is brought to you by Skillshare.
The videos you see me make on this channel take time to make, and in order to manage that time and all the stuff I need to make these videos, you need a good productivity system. Well, unfortunately, for the last few months, my productivity system has been somewhat falling apart, hence fewer videos than I would like coming out. Well, recently I decided to burn the old system down and build up something new. And you know what I did when I needed to build a new system? I went to Skillshare and watched Thomas Frank's course on productivity. His course goes over how to use a task manager in tandem with a calendar, as well as how to keep a productivity system functioning in the long term. And I would say this course isn't just useful for creator types myself, it's also useful if you're a student or you're working in a normal office place. You can learn to become more productive and keep your projects on track. You can get access to this course and many others through Skillshare, the all-in-one learning platform and community. It gives you access to thousands of video courses. Whether you need productivity help like myself, or if you have one of many other skills you need, you can find something for it on Skillshare. And I have a special offer for you. The first 1,000 people to click the top link in the description or in the pinned comment down below will get a free month trial of Skillshare Premium. Watch as many videos as you want. Judge whether or not this service is right for you. And if it is, I suggest sign up for a whole year. You really can't beat this value. Thank you Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And now, on with the history. 30 years ago, the geopolitical landscape dramatically changed.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
A committee made up of hardline KGB and defense chiefs named former Vice President Gennady Yanayev, a 53-year-old communist conservative, to replace Gorbachev.
This week produced one of those events that can change the course of civilization. The last president of the Soviet Union resigned his office, and the Soviet Union, the evil empire of its time, ceased to exist.
The Soviet Union dissolved, and Russia began its transformation from communism to capitalism. Exactly how capitalist Russia actually is today is up for debate, considering there are few to no protections for private property rights. And like everything else in modern Russia, this is a holdover from the Soviet era. When you hear people talk about modern Russia, you'll usually hear about two things: Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs. Most of us are familiar with who Putin is, the macho man president of the former Soviet Union. But who exactly are the oligarchs? They usually get thrown into the discussion without much detail of who they are or how they got there. The most detail you usually hear is that they are the billionaires who control Russia's most important and profitable industries, and that they are the ones who are propping up Putin.
As true as all that is, it ignores the bigger picture of how they all got there.
When you look at who is in power today in post-Soviet Russia, from the politicians to the oligarchs, all of them are former insiders of the Communist Party and the Soviet regime.
The Soviet Union? I thought you guys broke up.
Yes, that's what we wanted you to think.
How did former members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who supposedly were fighting against international capitalism, become not only the richest people in Russia, but among the richest people in the world? Well, it happened during the privatization process back in the early 90s, in which a small number of well-connected Soviet officials were able to bribe their way into ownership of the industries they used to manage. To fully understand how this happened, we need to take a look at the Soviet economy before the Gorbachev reforms.
In the last century, under the Russian Empire, this vast area was just beginning to build a modern economy and experiment with representative government.
Prior to the October and March revolutions, the economy of Tsarist Russia wasn't considered a strong contender for a socialist uprising. Karl Marx had theorized that the first country to experience a socialist revolution would be a fully industrialized capitalist country, such as Germany, Britain, or the United States. Marx was heavily influenced by the philosophical works of Hegel and the scientific writings of Charles Darwin, and thus saw history as an evolutionary process. Nations and societies have to go through certain phases of economic and political development before they can achieve socialism. In the 19th and early 20th century, Russia was considered to either be a late feudalist or very early capitalist phase of development, and therefore wouldn't have the same class consciousness as other countries with more industrial economies.
Later in his life, Marx was communicating with some socialist radicals in Russia, and in these letters he said that Russia might just be in a unique position of development.
That it could skip over the capitalist stage and move straight from feudal to socialist. The revolution happened, which was followed by a civil war. Afterwards, Vladimir Lenin, the new dictator, had to implement a collection of market reforms called the New Economic Policy, or NEP.
Basically, he introduced a small amount of capitalism, allowing farmers to sell whatever produce they had left after meeting a government quota. He did this in order to help alleviate famines that were breaking out during and after the Civil War.
The NEP wouldn't last long. By 1930 it was gone, and the era of the 5-year plans had begun.
The party secretary, Joseph Stalin, offered them a more attractive solution. Turn Russia into a modern, industrialized, socialist state and make this the basis from which to spread the world revolution. Private property was confiscated, and peasants were herded into collective farms. Threats and promises whipped the industrial workers into a frenzy of activity. No effort was spared by the state. The nation was transformed into a working camp. Hundreds of thousands of people who did not obey state orders were deported or executed.
The economy of the Soviet Union was mostly limited to weapons, agricultural products, and capital goods in order to make more of the former two. After Stalin's death, the economy began a slow, gradual diversification. But in that lies a problem which would become the Soviet Union's ultimate undoing.
One of the great struggles of a centrally planned economy is determining how much of a certain good should be produced.
By attacking Stalin, Khrushchev aimed at lifting the burden of fear and terror, which had paralyzed individual initiative in industry and agriculture. Now, for the first time, farm leaders and factory managers were urged to contribute new ideas and methods, still, of course, under the guidance of the party.
In a capitalist economy, they have various signals to guide these decisions, the most important of which being price. In the free market, the price of goods is determined by various forces, usually simplified as supply and demand. Price usually finds an equilibrium between these 2 points. In capitalist economies, entrepreneurs can look at the prices for particular goods and services. When they see certain ones are selling for a high price, this tells them that this market is being underserved, and therefore you can make more money if you provide that good or service. If the price is high, that producer will try to provide as much of that good as they can at the higher price for as long as they can. Other entrepreneurs seeing this happening join in. As more people begin to provide this good, the price will begin to go down. However, a centrally planned economy lacks this signal. All you have are the minds of whoever you put in charge of planning. Without surveying the entire country to see what they want, the best you can do is look at previous years of production and consumption. But how do you determine how much more of something to produce if that good completely ran out? How much greater was the demand than the supply? In a centrally planned economy, you don't have that information. This is what the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises referred to as the calculation problem, which his student Friedrich Hayek would later expand on as the knowledge problem.
Basically, no matter who you put in charge, they are never going to have enough information to calculate whatever good or however much of it a population is going to want or need. Now, in fairness, in a capitalist economy, you are never going to have perfect information either, and prices can be manipulated. But even with those obstacles, an entrepreneur in a capitalist economy is going to have better information as well as more freedom of action than a planner in a socialist economy. Now, I've used the phrase central planning a number of times throughout this video. However, when it comes to the latter decades of the Soviet economy, it becomes something of a misnomer.
As the Soviet economy began to diversify after Stalin's death, it became more and more difficult for the central planners to plan everything. So they began to split up the task amongst the numerous bureaucratic and ministerial bodies of the Soviet Union. Every industry had its own bureaucracy, and every time the Soviet government decided to participate in a new industry, they needed to add another one. All of these bureaucracies would grow over time, and every time a call for some kind of reform was made, they had to set up a new bureaucracy to implement it. In the Soviet system, the managers of mines and factories would have to send a request up the chain of bureaucracies for any resources needed to do the job. This request for resources could get sent on a wild kulak chase before finally reaching the committee or agency tasked with assigning production. This agency would then decide to reassign production tasks to the various factories, which would have to make their way back down to the managers, who would then have to submit a new request order for resources based on their new assignment. And this process could repeat itself several times before needed materials were distributed. This massive bureaucracy is what ultimately spoiled the privatization process.
Although all property and means of production were collectively owned, not everybody had equal access to these resources. People in positions of power and management had more access to these resources than the average Soviet citizen did, and this created massive corruption. The bureaucracies were so big that no amount of oversight could have expunged it, and there were no incentives for doing so, because salaries and revenues for directors and factories were fixed.
At the top of the Soviet hierarchy was, obviously, the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Below that you had various government ministries. Below that you had the vast, ever-expanding bureaucracies. And below them you had the enterprise directors, who were the ground-level managers of the economy. They were the ones who oversaw the day-to-day affairs in the factories, mines, and everything else. Because of how inefficient the bureaucracies were, the real planners in the Soviet economy were the directors. They would receive production assignments from various agencies of the state, but they had the discretion to alter their quotas. And since there was no financial incentive to increase production, they usually chose to lower them. The director and enterprise system was the ground-level organizing block of Soviet society. A worker didn't get to choose where they worked. You were assigned based on where the bureaucrats thought you would best fit. Where you worked also determined where you lived, where you got food and clothing, and if you had kids, where they would go to school. And all of these institutions were funded by the director. The state set a fixed amount of revenue for an enterprise. The director would be charged with distributing any money or resources allotted to the firm he managed. Well, one of the things that directors would always do is skim some of the allotted resources off the top for themselves.
It was very easy to do. Since there was little effective oversight, they could take more money for themselves than was actually allotted. They would also steal manufactured goods or raw materials and sell them on the black market in order to enrich themselves. And they could also enrich others whom they decided to give access to.
In the Soviet system, all workers were supposed to be equal and paid according to their needs and not their efforts. Because of this, there wasn't much incentive to work harder to get a promotion. If you wanted more material wealth, what you needed to do was ingratiate yourself with whoever had access to resources. Make yourself useful to the directors, and they would reward you. This usually meant aiding them in the appropriation of state property and resources. This network of relationships was created and exacerbated by the corruption and inefficiency of the Soviet economy. The system began to fall apart when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He was a reformer, but rather than reforming the economy, like China was doing under Deng Xiaoping, he put most of his focus on political reforms. These reforms allowed internal criticism for the first time, and the West would join in on this. The constituent republics all went their own way, and Russia was now under the control of Boris Yeltsin, who had been granted the power to rule by decree by the Russian Congress of People's Deputies.
Как глава высшей законодательной власти республики, я должен подчиняться воле народа и его полномочных представителей. Поэтому я в соответствии со своими обязательствами, данными в предвыборный период, заявляю о своем выходе из КПСС, чтобы иметь большую возможность эффективно влиять на деятельность Советов, готов сотрудничать со всеми партиями и общественно-политическими организациями республики.
Despite having all these powers, Yeltsin didn't prioritize political reforms, and the longer he delayed them, and thus delayed new elections, the more resistance he faced by the remnant Soviet institutions.
Yeltsin believed that holding elections before the privatization process could begin would undermine the process. He feared that holding the elections then and there would return the communists to power, because they had the most pre-existing political infrastructure.
He was also learning from Gorbachev's mistakes, which got him briefly ousted in a coup and eventually collapsing the USSR. Yeltsin wanted to avoid both a relapse into communism and the collapse of the Russian Federation, so he focused on the economy. Yeltsin brought in foreign advisors to help craft a program for privatizing the socialized economy.
They in the Yeltsin administration wanted the enterprises to be privatized out of the hands of the people who were controlling it before, and then to be made profitable or either liquidated in a free market manner. But the directors, as well as the workers who had ingratiated themselves to their patronage, wanted these factories to be privatized either into the hands of workers' collectives or into the hands of their former directors.
On top of the workers and the former directors, there were also local governments who opposed Yeltsin's proposed privatization plan. These local municipalities, consisting of housing and commissariats that were originally attached to the local factories, were dependent on taxes from these factories. The factory directors had tried to get their firms detached from the local municipalities in order to avoid those taxes, and were stalling the process further. There were also those who believed that the firms should only be privatized into the hands of people who lived near them. Yeltsin's final plans were unveiled in the fall of 1992, but they had been severely watered down, and this watering down would cause the problems we see now.
The system, as originally outlined, would give every citizen of Russia a voucher, which could be exchanged for a number of shares at a state-owned enterprise. They were transferable, meaning that they could be bought, sold, traded, or just given away at a whim. The original plan was to give these shares out on a first-come, first-served basis, but many exceptions and loopholes were added to the plan before the vouchers could be distributed.
Initially, 25% of the stocks in a company were reserved for the workers at that company, and another 5% had been reserved for the director. They were also given the chance to buy an additional 10% of the stocks at a 30% discount. leaving the old corrupting elements with ownership of up to 40% of the company.
However, these reserved shares were non-voting stock, meaning that although they got to own a part of the company, they had no say in how it was operated. The workers and directors were angered by this option, and so behind the scenes the directors began bribing members of the Yeltsin administration in order to make numerous alternatives for these firms.
One allowed workers' collectives to acquire 51% ownership of the factories. This alternative also gave the directors the option to buy out the workers' share of the stock if the firm was made profitable. About 2/3 of the state-owned enterprises would be privatized in this way. There were also many individual carve-outs made for specific companies and directors, which were bought out with all the appropriated wealth they had acquired during the Soviet period. On top of the corruption between the old directors and the Russian government, there was also exploitation of the commoners, especially in the rural areas. Most people living in the Soviet Union had no idea of how capitalism worked. They didn't know what stocks were, so when they were given these vouchers, they didn't know what to do with them. The only people who knew what stocks were and how they worked were higher-ups in the government and the party, especially those who worked in the foreign services, such as former KGB agent Vladimir Putin and his buddies who worked with him in East Germany. These people were able to go into the countryside and acquire these vouchers, usually by trading them for some kind of luxury good like makeup or alcohol. By the end of 1994, Yeltsin's government declared the economy to be officially privatized. Between the old factory directors and knowledgeable foreign service officers, the oligarchs were born. Those who controlled the newly privatized Russian economy were the same people who had controlled the collectivized Soviet economy. This was not a recipe for prosperity, as the new oligarchs used their connections within the Russian government to receive subsidies and other kickbacks. The volatility of the economy and the corruption that went along with it ultimately doomed Yeltsin's presidency. On December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin resigned as president and was succeeded by his prime minister, Vladimir Putin. Putin restored the confidence of investors, all the while backsliding on privatization. He nationalized several oil companies such as Gazprom and Rosneft, as well as taking over all oil pipelines.
Mikhail Gorbachev was arrested in October 2003 for tax evasion. Then, aged 40, he sat on one of Russia's biggest fortunes. He had acquired it through the privatization of massive companies in the 1990s.
Putin and the oligarchs were initially enemies, but as his friends gained more power amongst the oligarchs, and activist shareholders such as Bill Browder began causing more trouble for them, they eventually fell into Putin's orbit. And now they supply him with the lavish lifestyle of an absolutist monarch, all the while he uses the power of the Russian state to protect them. The more things change, the more they stay the same.